Operation Sovereign Borders is over in Australia. In essence, the way it works, that any boat that tries to reach Australia is going to be turned back at the border. Anyone in those boats are sent to be processed in places like Papua New Guinea. Sometimes they have a turnaround system and push those boats back. Sarah, in your mind, because I've got to say, Operation Sovereign Borders is somewhat controversial, depending on whose opinion you pay attention to. Does it work? Is it advisable? Is it the kind of thing that the UK should be looking to implement?
It does work, and that's something we've seen from Liberal governments. So in early 2000s, John Howard implemented the Pacific Solution, which was sort of a similar version of Operation Sovereign Borders, where we had offshore processing. And then Labour came in, sort of opened the floodgates, wound back all of the coalition's policies, and then we started having 20,000 arrivals in the last year of the Labour government coming in. And those were illegal arrivals, which meant over 50,000 people coming illegally. We had 1,200 deaths at sea. And under Labour, we had to open 17 detention centres. So they then tried to sort of wind back everything. And that's when the coalition came in and we were able to remove all children from detention, stop the boats, and close 19 detention centres. So it does work.
So you still stand by this policy. What about, so just explain to us how turn back works, because we don't really have that in the channel. So just explain that to the viewers if you would.
The turn back policy is military-led and now under Border Force, which is a new agency created under the coalition. And they essentially turn back boats to where their source or transit country was from, and we're safe to do so.
But turn back how? That's what I'm getting at. What does that mean? What do you do? How do you turn back a boat? I mean, I'm not being...
Tug it back.
I'm not being facetious, but yeah, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Do you tow it? Do you create waves to push it? I genuinely trying to understand what it is, because people at home... We don't have this as a policy here, and I know it's been criticised there. So what is it? It's a case of you connecting and you're towing that boat all the way back? So it's not about waves and pushing and things like that?
No, so it's just turning it back where it's safe to do so.
And why is it criticised so much then, the turn back aspect particularly? If that's what it is, it's a case of towing a boat as opposed to pushing it anywhere, or do you think it's fair, the criticism that bit gets?
I don't believe so, and it's not something that... Obviously, we've had a recent election, and that's not a policy that the new Labour government is going to remove.
They're sticking with it. Alp, where do you stand on all this?
Well, just on that turnaround business, we can, in fact, before the new legislation came in, Priti Patel directed that if it's safe to do so, we can actually turn boats back. So physically, one of our big ships gets in the way and said, you're not going any further, you've got to go back. Clearly, with the little dinghies, unseaworthy as they are, that is going to be difficult. With the Australians, a lot of the boats were actually towed back to Indonesia, where they were coming from. But then you were talking about much bigger boats. It was possible to do that. But I think the most interesting thing that Sarah said was no deaths. There were 1,600 deaths.
1,200.
Once this system started and they started to turn the boats around, or indeed having picked them up to take them to Papua New Guinea or wherever, they stopped coming. And that's the message that we keep getting from the Australians. Do this, turn them back, and they will stop coming. The problem is, of course, we're not dealing with Indonesia, we're dealing with France, a close partner, all sorts of difficulties. So I'm not sure that it's actually practicable to be doing it in the English Channel, but that's another matter.
Yeah, and also, Sarah, I mean, we say about this being a deterrent, etc., but I know that a lot of people have started coming from Sri Lanka. There's a lot of unrest there at the moment. So this seems to be gaining some momentum again, despite these policies currently being in situ in Australia. So is it that much of a deterrent?
It is, and particularly because you take away what the people smugglers sell. And that's a promise to sort of live in Australia or the UK or wherever it is, by saying, particularly for the Australian government, if you come to Australia illegally or attempt to, you'll never resettle in Australia. And that's where our resettlement policies came in with other countries, such as the US.
Matthew, where do you stand on it all?
So I found it quite interesting reading the independent report that came out yesterday, which was written by Alexander Downer, who's the former Foreign Minister of Australia as well. And in his recommendation, when it came to small boats, he highlighted three things. One, those boat turnarounds, which Border Force, from my best understanding, has refused to do. It is actually quite logistically difficult. And often in the Australian case, it doesn't just mean turning around the boat, it means actually putting them on basically unsinkable vessels and then basically effectively handing them over back to the Indonesian authorities. So you need cooperation then with the country you're trying to turn the boats back around to. He also recommended third country processing, so the equivalent of Rwanda, as well as, and I think this is absolutely essential, and this again, it makes everything else work, which is much closer working relationship with France. Whether we like it or not, it's the solution that works so well for Australia was originally called the Pacific solution because it meant working with countries across the Pacific. When you got those boats recently coming from Sri Lanka, it was working with the Sri Lankan authorities to try to prevent what is a very dangerous journey to Australia. The only practical way to try to stop those boats is to work and try to stop them either leaving France in the first place or trying to return them to France. I mean, if it was as simple as there was an agreement to say anyone who comes to the UK from France, they'll be put immediately back onto a boat and they'll be dropped back off safely in France, there'll be no reason to make those crossings anymore. But for as long as there's this political standstill between the UK and France, I think it's much more difficult to sort the situation out in the Channel.
But Matthew says about a political stance between France and the UK, but we've given the French government millions and millions of pounds to try and stop this, and it's been pretty unsuccessful.
200 million since 2015, in fact. However, there's a lot more to it than simply having an agreement with France, simply because France is part of the EU. France is part of the Schengen arrangement, whereby if you enter one of the EU plus a few other countries, frankly, you're in the EU. I think that what needs to be done is actually address the problem at the EU's borders where people are coming in. They don't suddenly descend from the sky on the northern shores of France. They enter the EU, and at that point, if they are indeed intending to come to the UK for a political asylum or indeed to enter to work or whatever, then at that point, what the French or any other EU country has to do is establish whether or not they're acceptable to us. They don't, frankly. There are 600,000 asylum seekers in the EU at the moment. There were 200,000 detected illegal entries into the EU last year. A lot of them apply for asylum in France or in other EU countries and are turned down before they get to us. All this is going on, and that's the background, that's the context. So to say, let's send them all back to France would be great. And if the French had any sense, that's exactly what they would do. However, there's a great deal more involved than simply doing that.
And Sarah, one of the things that I found quite interesting about Operation Sovereign Borders is that it's quite, when you look at the messaging, because anyone can see this, go into YouTube, go onto Google, whatever, put this in, you'll see the campaign videos. They're very stern, they're very straight talking, they're very kind of, you will not get asylum if you reach this kind of border. It's, there is no messing around. Yeah. And you know where you stand. It seems quite, well, it is quite military-led, very stern. And, one of the challenges here, I think, is that we talk tough with these policies, Rwanda or whatever it is, and then I wonder how much of that messaging is actually getting back to whether it's the people smugglers or indeed the people considering making that crossing, that if you even attempt this, if you come to the UK, Rwanda, for example, which we'll get into a bit later in the programme, that is the potential. I just wonder if the messaging of what the UK is trying to do is right. What's your thoughts on that?
I think this is something the coalition focused on, particularly going into the 2013 election, where we essentially had our Chief of Defence Force as the figurehead, saying, you will not come here. And we ran ads and ran that a very strong campaign to the point where, like, future elections, 2019, for instance, and the most recent one, the coalition didn't really focus any attention on that messaging. It wasn't a sort of key, critical campaign issue because it had been done. We'd sort of solved that, and those in Australia knew that. And we also had messaging going not just in Australia, but more broadly, which is critical.
Go on, Alp, briefly.
Well, going right back to the outset, when Sarah said that both parties, the main parties in Australia, are actually in favour, and it really would help if everyone, all our politicians, actually saw the sense of stopping this. People are going to die, undoubtedly, if it continues. The reason why it's going to continue as it will is that it works, as you've pointed out. If people come here and are told there's no way that you're staying, you're going to go back if you cross illegally, it would stop. Only 2-3 days ago, there was actually a clip of smugglers, of the traffickers, actually putting out one of their boats, saying, look, this is what happens. Get on one of our boats and you get rescued and picked up by a British ship.
I've seen some of them. It's like a holiday advertisement. It's like a infomercial for a travel company. I've seen a couple of them on social media. Sarah, we'll soon be saying goodbye to you, but we've enjoyed the insight in terms of Operation Sovereign Borders. Just in a word, if Liz Truss or Rishi Sunak were watching, your advice that the UK should adopt Operation Sovereign Borders?
Absolutely.
Absolutely, she says. Sarah Gall, thank you very much for your insight there.